Good morning, everyone. Today I'd like to discuss some of the work that we've been doing at OSU, modeling fluid absorption in anisotropic 3D printed cement-based materials. So just before I begin, I want to point that this is part of a collaborative project that we've been doing with Princeton University, and I'd like to thank Dr. Moini and Mr. Gupta for their contributions. So to start, I want to define general 3D printed structures as layered systems, where we have filaments side by side, as you can see on the picture on the left, that usually act as monolithic layers. And between these layers, we have interfacial regions with a different microstructure than that of the filament layers, as you can see on the diagram on the right, with the formation of different voids and channels. And as a result, the system ends up functioning as a binary layered system where we have alternating filament layers and interface layers with different properties. And this arrangement means that the system is expected to behave differently depending on the arrangement of these layers, which we define as anisotropy. And we want to look at how this anisotropy affects the durability of these systems, specifically in terms of fluid absorption. Now, there have been a few attempts to look at this experimentally. I'm showing you on the left a very typical setup for an absorption test that our group did, where we use a technique called neutron imaging to generate the plot on the right, where on the horizontal axis you have the increase in water content, and in the vertical axis you have the distance to the bottom of the sample. And we looked at these printed samples in two orientations, with the layers parallel and perpendicular to the main absorption direction. And while the plot shows that there is a noticeable and a significant difference in the fluid intake depending on the orientation of these layers, it was very challenging to identify and to quantify the contribution of the filament layers and of the interface layers to the transfer patterns that happen in these systems. So in order to address these challenges, we propose a complementary approach, which is to use fluid absorption modeling, where we use finite element analysis to implement a well-established equation that is used to describe the transport of fluid in porous media. I can answer specific questions about this equation later, but for now, I only want to highlight a few things. The first one is that what this equation essentially describes is how the degree of pore saturation, so the relative amount of fluid in the pores of the system, changes temporally and spatially. The second thing I want to highlight is that the model has a term that describes the transport of liquid fluid, as I highlighted in blue, and fluid vapor, as highlighted in white. In this case, the liquid transport is mostly governed by capillary absorption, while the vapor transport is governed by diffusion, because we know that both of these phases are present in the porous structure, but since they don't move in the same way, we have specific physical expressions to account for the transport of each of these phases. And the third thing is that the model also considers the equilibrium between the liquid and the vapor phases, specifically in terms of the degree of saturation, S in blue, and the relative pore vapor pressure, H in white. And the way the model considers this equilibrium for each material is through the curve that you see on the left that we call absorption isotherm. There we go. So we have validated this model by comparing the simulation predictions to a couple of fluid absorption experiments that our group did a few years ago with two mortars with different water to cement ratios. And as you can see on the four plots on the right, the red and blue curves corresponding to the simulation predictions match the scattered experimental data really well. Now, with the right tool at hand, since our interest is to study these 3D printed structures, we establish a representative geometry to simulate in our finite element analysis software, consisting of alternating layers representing the filaments that are thicker and the interfaces that are thinner. We chose for representing the filament layers to use a mortar with a water to cement ratio of 0.3, and for the interfaces, a mortar with water to cement ratio of 0.5. And the rationale behind this choice is that we're aware that the interfaces have a higher porosity, a higher pore connectivity, and larger pores when compared to the filaments, just like a 0.5 mortar has when compared to a 0.3 mortar. We consider two layer orientations for our analysis when the layers are perpendicular and parallel to the main absorption direction, and we assume that all faces of the system are sealed except the one at the bottom where we assume that the system is fully saturated, and our results are in terms of degree of saturation two-dimensional contour plots. Now, this is one of the example contour plots. So again, the contour is in terms of the degree of saturation. The horizontal axis indicates the horizontal coordinates, the vertical axis, the vertical coordinates, and the color bar indicates the degree of saturation. So as the colors shift from red to blue, we represent the system progressively absorbing fluid. The time step of the simulation is shown on the top left, and I've just written in the contours what I mean by filament layer and interface layer, as well as their respective compositions, since I'm going to be using this terminology to describe the layer system moving forward. Now I present the same plot, but now for the layers in the parallel orientation to the fluid boundary at the bottom. And as I advance through the next slides, hopefully without too much trouble, we'll be able to follow along and see how fluid absorption progresses in these systems. At the final time step of 96 hours, we can already see how the height of the absorption front in both of these cases is not the same. And specifically on the plot on the right, there is clearly some horizontal fluid movement going on. But before moving forward with analysis, I'd like to establish a couple of baseline scenarios that we can compare to these layered anisotropic systems. And the baseline scenarios are rather straightforward. Let's look at the isotropic cases where we're using the materials that we're using to represent this layered system. So on the left, we have a system that only consists of the 0.3 mortar that we're using to represent the filament layers, and on the right, the 0.5 mortar that we're using to represent the interface layers. And similarly, as I click along, we can observe the progression of fluid absorption after 96 hours, and as expected, the material with a higher water-to-cement ratio is quite less resistant to fluid absorption. And with all the simulation data in hand, let's proceed with the analysis to really clarify what is happening in the layered systems. And the goal of our analysis is to answer these two questions. What is the role of the interfaces in fluid absorption, and how does this role change, or whether it changes with the orientation of the layered system? And the way we're going to do a quantitative analysis is to take the information we have in the contour plot and do two things to it. The first one is that we're going to take the average for each layer at each vertical position to account for the fact, like in the example that I'm showing you on the left, the absorption front is not exactly sharp, but we want to be able to compare these systems with a single number. And the second thing is that we're going to go from a relative measure of fluid absorption, which is the degree of saturation, to an absolute measure of absorption, which is the amount of fluid that we have, the mass of fluid that we have inside the pores, so that these results can be directly comparable to experimental results where it's not trivial to obtain the saturation to separate the interface and the filament layers. And for instance, starting with the filament layers, this is what the moisture profile looks like. You'll see that the horizontal axis is now in terms of the evaporable water content in grams of water per grams of mortar. I'm using the arrows to indicate where the data is coming from, and I've also included a vertical line that represents the evaporable water content, in this case for the filament layers, when the system is fully saturated. Similarly, we can obtain the same moisture profile at this time step now for the interface layers, as you can see in the dotted red curve. And I also added another vertical line to indicate what the interfaces look like when they're fully saturated. And even though the saturation is the same, the lines are not superimposed because the porosity of the interfaces is higher than the one in the filaments, so they are able to soak up more fluid at the same saturation level. And with all that established, now I'm going to go through a few selected comparisons that are going to bring forward the moisture transport patterns that are happening in these layered systems. So the first one is a comparison when the layers of the layered system are perpendicular to the main absorption direction to their isotropic counterpart. Now, because our layered system mostly consists of filaments, the appropriate comparison in this case is to an isotropic scenario where the entire domain is a filament, so the entire domain is constituted by the mortar with a water-cement ratio of 0.3. So we're going to go from these two contour plots to a couple of one-dimensional moisture profiles. As you can see on the right, where the curve for the perpendicular system, for the layer system in the perpendicular orientation is the full dark curve, and the dotted gray curve represents the isotropic counterpart. The first thing you'll notice in the dark curve is that there are bumps at the locations where the interface is, and at the lowest interface, you will see that that interface layer absorbs a significantly larger amount of fluid than the rest of the system, which, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, makes sense since the interface have a higher porosity, so they can soak up more fluid. But when we compare the rest of these two curves, we'll notice that they're actually very similar, and that in the layered case, the filaments only absorb a slightly higher amount of fluid than when compared to its isotropic counterpart. And our initial conclusion from these results is that when the layers are perpendicular, the interfaces act as sponges, meaning that they're capable of soaking up a significant amount of fluid, but they don't affect the transport going through the filaments that much. And with that established, we want to see if we go from the interfaces being perpendicular to parallel, how does this transport pattern change? Now, when looking at the layers parallel to the absorption direction, since we're able to separate now what's going on in the filament layers and in the interface layers, there are two pertinent comparisons. So for the filament layers, we want to compare to the isotropic system that consists of the material used for the filaments. And similarly, for the interfaces, we want to compare them to the system where the entire system consists of the material, the 0.5 mortar that we're using to represent the interfaces. First, when comparing the filaments in the layered system in the parallel orientation to its isotropic counterpart, it is quite clear that the blue curve corresponding to the layered system shows a significantly higher amount of fluid being absorbed by the filaments in this case, meaning that in the layered system, there is an additional source of fluid coming into the filaments when compared to its isotropic counterpart. However, when we look at the interface layers, we see that the opposite happens, and that the red dotted curve is below the gray one that corresponds to the isotropic case. So in the layered system, the interfaces have a sink that is removing moisture, that is removing fluid from them. And putting these two together really clarifies what is happening in the layered system when the layers are parallel to the absorption direction. There is additional lateral horizontal moisture transport, fluid transport from the interface layers to the filament layers, and more than that, the interfaces act as transport channels that further the transport of fluid through the filaments. And to talk just a little more about that, on the left, I've included the curves for both the filaments and the interfaces when the layers are arranged parallel to the absorption direction. And you can see that as the height increases, these curves come closer together as further indication that there is this lateral transport from the interfaces to the filaments. And when we think about the fundamentals of transport in porous media, this pattern makes quite a bit of sense because the interface layers are very permeable, so they don't offer a lot of resistance to this initial flow from the bottom of the system, but because they have larger pores, they have less suction to continue absorbing it upwards. While for the filament layers, it is the opposite. They offer a very high resistance to flow coming from the bottom layer to the main absorption direction, but when the interfaces allow an easier access to this fluid from the sides, then the filaments who have smaller pores have a higher suction to pull the fluid from the interfaces and ultimately lead to an increase in fluid absorption. And finally, bringing all these simulation results back together, on the left, I have a comparison between the two orientations for our layered system. In black, you have it perpendicular, and in orange, I combined both the absorption from the filaments and from the interfaces for the parallel case, and we can see that our representative model geometry matches the results that we obtained experimentally quite well, where we see that there is an overall higher fluid absorption when the layers are arranged parallel to the absorption orientation compared to the perpendicular case. So, to summarize what I'd like you to take home with you today, a finite element model was used to simulate fluid absorption in an anisotropic 3D printed mortar, and we looked at the system in parallel and perpendicular orientations relative to the main absorption direction. We have confirmed that fluid transport is directional in these cases, and we made the distinction that when the interfaces are perpendicular to the absorption direction, they act as sponges, soaking up a significant volume of fluid, but with little influence to the overall absorption in the filaments, while on the other hand, when the interfaces are parallel, they act as transport channels, bringing fluid to the filaments through lateral transport and leading to an overall increase in fluid absorption. Finally, I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation and the University Transportation Center for their financial support, and to you all for attending this presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.